Okay, short video to address a couple questions from class, and it's a good questions that it's good follow-up actually from the first four tutorials, and maybe it'll be a bit of a review as well. But we're going to talk a little bit more now, more specifically about adding structure to these to these surfaces in order to model the boats with more detail. This is the sample form that Keith put together. I'm just going to, for the purposes of this exercise, I'm going to just kind of hide that top plane, even though everything that I'm doing throughout the tutorials here will still work with those intact. But just for clarity, I'm just going to work with a single surface for each one of these. A couple different techniques, and I'll start with maybe the more simple one, which is just going to be to bypass the use of the isocurves themselves for sections and introduce a set of orthogonal sections into the surface. So you can see that the way that this was modeled, we have a series of isos that sort of they basically follow that bottom curve, which is pretty nice. But if that's not the way it's being constructed, we can just run the simple section command in order to introduce a new set of sections that are spaced out to whatever dimension that is desirable for your build. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set up some construction lines and work off of them. So I'm just going to go to my red layer here and I'm just going to draw a line out basically to some arbitrary distance off from the furthest most point on each end of the boat here, like that, because I'm basically just finding the extents in that direction. And then I'm just going to project these down to the C-plane. So you can type in project to C-plane. You can actually delete the input objects. We don't need them. Really all I'm doing here is just trying to set myself up with again, like just the kind of boundaries. Then I'm going to just draw a line anywhere along that line perpendicular to this one. And here's where I can now use this line to set myself up with a set of points that are spaced exactly how I'd like the sections to be spaced in the boat. So how are you going to build the frame and at what distances apart? I'm just going to do this kind of arbitrarily, so I'm just going to select this and divide it. You can obviously do this with particular dimensions, moving points, or dimensioning out exactly where you'd like the sections to occur. So I'm just going to type in divide and go with, I guess, default of 10, and just divide this line equidistant into equidistant points. Okay, as an example. And then I'm just going to run the section command. It's quite simple actually, so we can just run, select these, and they could be joined or not. I guess I'll join them. And I'm going to head over to my top view for this next part and just type in section. And then I'm just going to run down the line here, just selecting each point and just holding shift and just kind of running down the line. That first one you probably don't need. Matter of fact, let me zoom in on that there. And just kind of snap to that point, cut across, holding shift, clicking, and then it'll draw the section. It might be hard to see with the white background, but the sections are being drawn along the surface, which will be more clear in just a second. It's just that they're yellow right now because they're being selected still. I'll just do that one. Alright, hit enter and take a look what we have in 3D here. Yeah, so here's basically the center lines for your, well, you can decide on this. These could either be the center lines, which would be the easiest way to think about them since these are equidistant. But if you were, and once we go through the next step, if you were imagining a certain way of adding thickness to these, you may want to change up these dimensions just a little bit, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But for the meantime, you can just imagine these are center lines, and what we'll do is we'll extrude them out in both directions to make the thickened frame element. And maybe I was just thinking, maybe just for the sake of keeping it kind of clean at the ends here, I'm just going to use. You can design in a custom kind of part at the end here, depending on how you want to end the boat. You can also kind of lop this off. You'll have to figure out how you want the ends to appear. So if you're going to build like this, is the end, Is it a flat end or is it a kind of tilted one? If it's going to be a tilted one, you can just duplicate that edge and work off of it. And a little bit later on, we can look at a solution for that. But in the meantime, what I'll do actually is just I'm actually going to set up another construction line here. And I'm just going to use those corners basically as a way to, as a way to kind of slice the ends off so that they're all nice and straight, something like that. Alright. Good enough. I don't need these. Delete. And then I'm just going to quickly just sort of trim the surface there. Yeah, and again, this may not apply to what you need to do for your project, but just for the sake of clarity and just in terms of keeping for this exercise all of the sections kind of parallel to one another, I'm just going to do it this way. Okay. And just a note to to remind you that one of the reasons why we want to model the form first is so that these sections, these structural sections, are always going to be in line with one another relative to the shape of the object. I've seen some folks trying to match sections that were drawn without the surfaces and trying to kind of fit them into the surface. Really, again, what we're trying to explore is a different sort of process, a different sequence, which is basically modeling out the desired form first, and then building the structure into it so that everything is coordinated, everything lines up. All right, so this is why we have the form first, and we took the sections from it. These sections now, of course, align directly with the surface on the outside. Now, there's a couple different ways you can go about adding thickness to this. There's you either offset in or offset out. If you offset in, we'll explore one option for that, but it's assumed that the current dimensions you have here are the maximum. If you offset out, it's assumed that you've already accounted for the material thickness. And it just sort of depends which one to choose, sort of depends on the kind of surface you have. And how to do the offsetting. So for example, with this surface, it's going to be an advantage for us to offset out just because of how tight this radius is here. And that just means that the surface offsetting will be more successful in that case. That's not going to be the case for every project. But offsetting out, just based on how I'm seeing a lot of the boats coming to resolution at the front and back, might make a lot of sense just because they come to a point. Right? But again, it is a kind of a case-by-case scenario. But we'll look at a couple different options. So for this one here, we'll kind of go through kind of an offsetting in methodology. We'll use the curve to do this instead of the surface. So I'm just going to type in offset and give it. This one's a little bit too big for that, so actually what I'll do instead is just work with some of the others. Maybe I'll change the dimensions. Sorry, maybe I'll just change this to 1. Yeah, that looks better. And I'm going to put it on the right layer, so let's run that again. And I'm basically just offsetting this curve inward. Basically setting a dimension to the structural rib. And this will vary by project, obviously. Okay, so we'll work within those boundaries here. Let's see if everything's clean, looks good. Let's see if this one works. This one may or may not work just based on we'll have to customize that one later, no big deal. And then what I'm going to do is just connect them all, because what I'm going to end up doing is, well, I suppose you can loft these as well. So one option is to kind of loft those curves into planar surfaces, but I'm going to close them out and select them as kind of closed profiles and go that way. You could either start with a lofted surface, or you can kind of follow along with this process, which will actually be to first start with a profile and then extrude that profile, giving it thickness, and then capping that extrusion so that it's modeled as a solid. There's a variety of ways to go about this. You could, if you go with the lofted surface, you can just extrude the surface as well. So it's more or less the same thing. It just gives you a center surface that you'll have to either put on a different layer or delete. Okay, so Okay, so that's one technique. Good enough. Now I'm just going to select all those like that and just join them. We've got a bunch of closed curves. Now what I'm going to do is extrude them just to kind of illustrate something here. So let's extrude these curves. It's going to give us the option to do both sides up in the command line, so let's click that on. Let's zoom in so we can control this thing. Let's see where is it going to, okay, it's going to choose the first one. You know, and here's where you can plug in a dimension. So the extrusion distance, I guess I'll just put in 0.25 because it's going to basically extrude in that distance on both sides, so that overall it'll be a 0.5 unit thickness in this case. And I'll just go ahead and click OK. So we've started to add thickness to the ribs here, but as you can see, of course, we're going to have some issues with collisions going on because the surface was centered before and it's not accounting for that thickness. A couple things we can do here. One, we can offset the surface so that it just about hovers over the top of that. Okay, so let's look at that. And you know, this might be an okay option, you know, if you're not too worried about a perfectly precise, you know, connection there. If it's just a model for kind of as a concept model, I'm just going to guess as to how far that needs to go, and then I'm going to flip it. Let's try that again. Looks like it didn't quite go far enough. Offset surface. And pay attention to the arrows here. The arrows are going to flip it in or out. If you type in F, the arrows will flip around. The distance might have to go a little bit further, so I'm just going to do that. And then I'm also going to do that again and turn solid off. Okay, so then we just create a new surface. There we go. I'll hide this one. So now we no longer have any collision, okay, but we also still have some gap there, right? So this might be okay for like a quick model, and you know, if you're doing views of it from a distance, you know, you won't get any sort of collision going on. It'll appear as though the surface is wrapping the frame, and that might be good enough. Or it may not be good enough. So we'll have to look at it a couple different ways here. If you really want it to, you know, to be sure that it's touching only one of these edges, you can either duplicate those edges and rebuild the surface, basically doing a re-lofting, or what we can do is just be a little more careful with how we're extruding those structural elements. This is the case if we want them to be on center. But another thing you can do probably, if you had already given some thought to the spacing, is extrude them such that they don't. I'm going to go ahead and just kind of select these poly surfaces here and deselect some other stuff. Just to go back to this point, what we can do is extrude it so that we know for sure that they don't interact with the surface. So we can extrude these inward, and we can extrude on this side the other direction. Okay, so let's try that out, and we'll do this one at a time to figure it out here. So let's go with extrude curve. This one might be a little bit tricky, so I'm going to start with that one. Instead of both sides, I'm going to go with just one side, and then I'm going to place my, so basically I'm going to place this thing and type in 0.5 and place my cursor so that it goes in the right direction, and I want it to go that way. Just go ahead and click. Now what we've done is we've extruded it out so that it only touches at that edge because we've extruded it inward into the surface. I can try this one as well, see how that works. Looks like it might be okay. 0.5, hit enter, should be fine. We have a little bit of interaction going on here where this thing straightens out, and you can kind of clean that up in post-processing, or maybe even clean up the profile a little bit, but it's pretty minor. But in terms of a screenshot though, or kind of rendered view, you may see some aliasing there, you may see some overlap, so it's something that you're going to have to watch out for. Making this process a little bit imperfect for a couple reasons, that being one, but also because these sections are no longer centered anymore. But for the sake of, oops, I'm going to reset that distance now. There we go. And now here was where we have to turn them back on themselves, right? So now we actually have to extrude them to the other direction, which is still inward toward the center. And I'm still avoiding that overlap. right between the structure and the surface. So that's working pretty nicely. Okay, so there's that. We should now be able to just select, let's just go ahead and select layer, and I'll deselect some of this other stuff. And you can just type in cap, and that ought to just force them now to be. It'll rebuild that planar surface in there for us automatically, so we don't have to do it manually. And because they're planar, that works. You can cap planar open poly surfaces, and it should add a cap to it. In this case, it'll add the front and back profile surface. And yeah, so that's a start at adding some structural ribs to this form without interacting with the surface too much. There's still some issues though. You might see very minor issues here and there. So in that case, a very subtle offset of the surface may be in order. So let's, for example, turn this around, and we can just very, very slightly, even just like 0.0 something, move that out. We can hide this. Flip that back to the layer that I meant it to be on. There we go. And now, you'll see that it reads much nicer. Clearly, those structural parts are inside the surface. There's no more intersecting going on just due to the offset. But it's so close that even in a drawing, it would be kind of hard to tell unless you're doing a highly detailed, call-out section or a call-out detail where you're focusing in on how that connection is made. And in that case, you would do a different kind of model. Or you would just post-process it and draft it so that it looks appropriate. All right. Okay, so that's one technique to kind of offset inward, just using the curves and not really playing much with the surface. We'll explore another one, which is going to be to add thickness to the surface itself before we take the sections. Okay, so let's do that. And to do that, I'm going to make a copy of, I guess I'll take this, and I'll take my construction lines as well. And I'm just going to copy that over here.